We begin tonight with a call for humans to drastically change their diets in order to save the planet. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says current efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are not enough. The report was prepared by more than 100 experts from 52 countries, and it says eating more plants and less meat would have a big impact on reducing global warming. The study found from 2007 to 2016, a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions came from agriculture and forestry. One of the most potent gases is methane, and it comes from cattle and rice fields. Deforestation and the removal of peatlands cause significant levels of carbon emissions as well.
More balanced diets could help us adapt to and limit climate change. Some diets require more land and water and lead to higher emissions than others. For example, diets that are high in grains, nuts and vegetables have a lower carbon footprint than those that are high in meat, and they lead to better health outcomes. But of course, dietary choices are influenced by local production practices and cultural habits.
So what would happen if the world ate only plants? How much would that clean up our climate problems? Well, according to Statistics Canada in 2017, 10% of greenhouse gas emissions released came from the agriculture industry. Joining me now is Navin Ramankudi. Navin is the Canada Research Chair in Global Environmental Change and Food Security at the University of British Columbia. He's in our Vancouver studio. Navin, let me ask you straight up, what would happen if the world ate only plant-based food starting today?
Yes, thanks, Carol, for that question. We've done an estimate of how much of our calories today that we grow around the world would be freed up if we all switched to a plant-based diet. It was a study done a few years ago by one of my colleagues, and we estimated that we would free up about 70% of today's calories by switching to a vegan diet. That means this is a huge part of the solution, that shifting diets can free up 70% of calories, which means we might need 70% less of our land or other resources to grow our food.
Okay, 70% less of our calories. What does that mean? Put that in terms that, as an individual, I could understand what it would mean for me.
Yeah, so the simplest way to think about it is that the kind of food we eat has an impact on how efficiently we get our calories. So if we eat grain directly, we get a certain amount of calories. But if you want to get that same amount of grain from meat, say chicken, poultry, pork or beef, it's far less efficient. That's because as these animals eat those grains and then transform that into calories that we later eat, that's far less efficient. So people have estimated that eating beef is maybe 10 to 20 times more inefficient than eating the grain directly. So it's not just the amount of food we eat, but the type of food we eat that matters. Okay. And so the idea is that you switching away from meat or even switching away from beef towards pork or poultry can make a big difference in terms of efficiency.
Okay, and what would it mean for climate change?
Yeah, so for climate change, it means that if we need less calories, if you are able to free up 70% more calories, that means we need to produce less food on this planet. That means we could use less land to produce the food. It means we could avoid tropical deforestation. It means we wouldn't need all of this livestock that we currently maintain around the planet to produce the food that releases methane. We wouldn't need to apply as much fertilizer on the land, which causes nitrous oxide emissions. So essentially, it means that the impact of our food system on greenhouse gas emissions and climate would be drastically reduced.
Okay, what is the problem with cattle specifically?
There are two things. First of all the grain we produce on the planet today, about a third of all the grain is fed to animals, fed to cattle, which then converts it into meat calories, which is inefficient, as I mentioned before. The second thing is that cattle also emit methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and it's a far more potent, far more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Cattle and sheep and some other animals that we call ruminants, they're kind of particular in the sense that they have 4 chambers in their stomachs, and so they the way they digest their food results in methane emissions, which is a powerful greenhouse gas.
Right. So as I understand it, they release it by burping and passing gas.
That's correct. Most of it comes through burping, but yeah.
Okay, most of it through burping. Okay.
Yeah.
At the same time, demand for food, including meat and dairy, is expected to increase exponentially as our population is expected to increase.
Yeah, there are two different drivers. One is the number of people itself going up. We are currently around at 7 billion, and we are expected to go up to 10 billion by 2050 and beyond. In addition, as people are getting wealthier, they are switching to increasingly meat-based diets. So the inefficiency in terms of our consumption is also increasing. So people are consuming more, and there are more people.
And then there's the human, cost. 1.3 billion people are employed in this industry globally. So how realistic is it to get people to move to a plant-based diet?
I mean, there are some shifts that are already happening. I completely agree that there is a human cost to any kind of shifts that we make, and so there will need to be a transition that's very thoughtful. But there are some signals. In the United States, there's been a big shift away from beef towards poultry, and that's actually a good thing in terms of environmental impacts, because eating poultry is much more efficient. The increase in consumption of sort of plant-based foods like the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Meats sort of indicates that people are actually taking to this idea. The other thing that people have to realize is that this is also good for your health. Recently, there was a study looking at the global burden of disease related to our food consumption. And while the big impact on health was related to increased consumption of salt or sodium, the next 4 categories were all related to not eating enough fruits and vegetables, not eating enough nuts, not eating enough unprocessed food. So I think if people realize that eating more fruits and vegetables is good for your health and good for the environment, that can be a win-win.
The report also points out, Navin, that 25 to 30% of total food produced is lost or wasted. How big a problem is that?
That's another huge part of the problem. So, we use all of the world's land resources. We use all this water, we use land, we use fertilizers to grow all this food, and then a huge portion is lost or wasted. A study for Canada that was done last year, or earlier this year, I think, said that the estimate for Canada was over 50%. So essentially, we are using all these resources and then we are wasting it. And that happens at 2 different places. In most of the developed world, most of the waste happens at the consumer level. People buy the food and let it rot in their refrigerators because they don't eat it fast enough, or in the restaurants when the food portions are too large. In developing countries, most of the waste happens before it gets to the consumer. It happens because they don't have cold storage systems or the technologies to kind of preserve the food.
Okay, so what's the answer to that? Get restaurants to serve smaller portions, to be more mindful of the food we're buying?
Exactly. I think awareness can make a huge difference, but policies can also make a big difference. In Vancouver, there was a move for some grocery stores to make blemished vegetables and fruits available at a lower price. So that could be a simple shift that helps people make choices that make more sense for the environment.
The report also says the problem can be addressed through sustainable land management and partially through improved grazing management. Talk to me a little bit about that, and also, what do you think? Where does Canada's cattle industry come in? How sustainable are we?
So there's 2 different ways to look at the Canadian system. One is that, as you mentioned at the beginning, agricultural emissions are only about 10% of total emissions. But we also have to think about the footprint of our diet. Canada imports a lot of our food, so not all the food that we consume in Canada is produced within Canada. So the footprint of our diet is, Canadians are fairly wealthy. We eat a lot of meat, and so our footprint is much higher. It's the estimate from the Food and Agricultural Organization suggests that Canada, the average amount of protein a person eats in Canada is around 100 grams per person per day, when the recommended amount is about 40 grams per person per day. So we eat maybe 2 times as much protein as we need. And so this is a large footprint, and so we could shift our diets. But in terms of grazing management, there are some studies that show if grazing is managed properly, that grazing lands can actually sequester carbon, they can actually take up carbon. So while animals might actually emit methane, if the land is managed properly, we could offset some of that methane emissions by sequestering carbon into the soils.
All right. Naveen Ramankuti, Canada Research Chair in Global Environment Change and Food Security at the University of British Columbia. Naveen, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
My pleasure.
So, how are cattle producers reacting to this study tonight? My next guest says this report is disappointing as the cattle industry was not consulted. Dennis Laycraft is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. He is the President of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. It's an organization that represents over 60,000 beef farms here in Canada. And Dennis joins me now from Calgary. Dennis, welcome to you.
Good evening.
If you had been consulted, Dennis, what would you have told the researchers?
Well, I'm sure there's a chance. Similar UN reports, we've worked with a number, particularly Government of Canada researchers at places like Lethbridge and with other countries, and submitted more data. Clearly, what you're hearing earlier was a bit of an oversimplification of agriculture. Canada has one of the strongest roundtables for sustainable beef in the world.
Oh, okay, tell me, I'm really interested in that. What is it that makes Canadian beef strongly sustainable?
Well, there are a number of things. We've been working for many years. When you look at sustainability, there's kind of 3 pillars to it. You need to be economically viable if you're going to remain in business. You have to be environmentally sound and socially responsible. And the roundtable really brings all of the conservation groups, a number of other non-government organizations. We work with our customers who are in retail, food service, and of course we have the industry, the research community, academics, and we sit down and we're constantly measuring what we're doing. For instance, Canada's greenhouse gas footprint from cattle is half of the world average because of the efficiencies we have. In North America, it isn't about deforestation, particularly and once you get into Canada and clearly into the northern part of the United States, it's about preserving native grasslands.
Okay, so how does Canada do that?
Well, the major threat to native grasslands is cultivation. So if you're going to keep those lands out of cultivation, they need to be used productively. And the most productive use for those lands is grazing cattle. And we've also invested considerably as we've looked at grazing management. Over 80%, as much as 86% of cattle's diet are not grain. It's actually forages. It's these grasses, or it may be hay that's cut that's part of a crop rotation. And then that small amount for finishing is grains, and even a fair amount of that grain is actually feed grain rather than food grain. And if you have weather events, you can suddenly turn a lot of food grain because it gets damaged, it can be discolored, it can sprout into feed grain. So you actually have a very valuable outlet for that grain to go to cattle in our case. And it actually makes growing grain more sustainable as well. There's a really complementary relationship when you have a balanced agriculture system. Mm-hmm. You can actually improve soil fertility. Contrary to what you're hearing earlier, you actually reduce the use of chemical fertilizer, and you can increase the organic matter in soils. So for croplands, that means it'll retain more moisture. And as you deal with drier years, you'll actually get higher yields, and the land is more fertile. So again, when you take a look at it from the relationship between crop production and livestock production, there are actually many benefits. This doesn't even get into all of the benefits related to the preservation of endangered species and the biodiversity that you actually find on native grasslands.
Okay, how do you balance? Let's break down one of the things you said, because also Naveen was saying something similar, is that you need to balance the use of fertilizer to minimize the release of nitrous oxide, for example. So how does Canada do that, for example, in its sustainability?
Well, depending on your type of operation, you'll be putting on, it's manure that you're putting on as organic fertilizer. In some cases it's composted for a period of time and then it's put on, or others you'll put it on, you'll actually cultivate it down into the ground. You know, at the same time, when you're talking about nitrates, as you grow more legumes, which are alfalfa and that, they have deep roots, and they actually fix nitrogen from the atmosphere down into the soil. That's one of the great benefits when you have that in your crop rotation, that you're actually putting nitrogen down, which is an important nutrient for plants. It's down where those roots will reach it, but it's out of the atmosphere.
Okay, Agriculture Canada, let's talk about the methane, to put it in basic terms, the burping and the passing of gas in cows. Agriculture Canada says a cow releases between 70 and 120 kilograms of methane per year, or in some cases the equivalent of the greenhouse gas emissions of a car driven 20,000 kilometers per hour. What is Canada doing to try to mitigate those issues?
Well, a lot of it really comes back to management, and it comes back to the genetics that we use. You know, as we start to look at different things that'll improve the digestion, which is all good for your production as well. The more efficiently you digest these items, and the majority of things that cattle eat are actually feed items that humans can't eat. So the idea that you're going to produce more food by not grazing those lands is erroneous. Those are lands that are not suitable for crop production, where most of the cattle are grazed. It's either too rough, or it's too prone to erosion, or they're marginal lands, it's too sandy.
Right, but on the methane issue, I heard seaweed. You were considering feeding seaweed to cattle. I understand that the Canadians are working with the Australians for the genetically modified feed that would reduce methane emissions. How are those producing any kind of solutions?
You know, I don't think there's one thing that's going to be ideal for every area. We continue to work particularly with the researchers in Lethbridge, and we have our Beef Cattle Research Council, and we're working with the dairy industry as well, very closely at each development around the world, and we're trying to see how it fits with the type of grasses that we have in our system as well. Again, as we look at genetics and management, you know, there are ways you can, when you harvest feed, you can harvest in a way that's more digestible as well. All of those things just get into the quality of animals that we're feeding, and then the skill of the management of the farmers and ranchers that make up our industry, which is why when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, less than half the average of the rest of the world. So there's a lot going on. We've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 15% over the last 30 years. We continue to work on reducing those further, and that's part of the reason, you know, all the things we're doing. We were the first country in the world to have a verified sustainable beef claim for marketing, and you're finding that at places like McDonald's, and you're finding it more recently at Harvey's. So we continue to work to try and be leaders in this area.
Okay, one more question for you. How is climate change affecting your members, the cattlemen of this country?
Well, no one lives with weather more directly than people who are farming and ranching. And clearly, as you try and look at your operation, you try and manage it in a way that it will stand up to either drought stress, or you may have, sometimes there's just too much moisture at the wrong time of year. It could be early snows for harvesting, which is again back to where when you have cattle and crop production together, sometimes hail will destroy a crop, but it still can be silaged and fed to cattle. Or as I said, sometimes it's damaged and it's no longer suitable for food. It makes excellent feed. And when you have the two together, you can manage these weather events much better than you could with trying to just go with crop production.
All right, Dennis Laycraft, the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.